All right, I want to say greetings and peace to everyone who has tuned in, who received the notification. Welcome to the Amara Squad Media, our YouTube channel. This is our new YouTube channel. So you can find us here. Same channel. We'll be doing these shows on a regular basis like we did in the past. So again, welcome to the Amara Squad Media. And again, we are the Amara Squad. And for those who may be newly tuned in to us and don't know about us, we call ourselves the Amun Ra Squad, and we use those two terms, those Kemetic deities' names, Amun and Ra, combined to symbolize two aspects. Amun, most people are familiar with having the meaning of hidden, and Ra being a word or deity, as they say, of the sun, things that are seen. So you have the unseen and the seen. And so as the Amun Ra Squad, as a small group of people, we've come together with different talents and different skills and different qualifications. And all of us, we have a like mind, and we come together to address things that are hidden, things that people don't pay attention to, things of what I would call under the hood that people may not see on the surface and pay attention to and often neglect. And also we pay attention to the here and now, with subjects such as food, clothing, shelter, what's going on in current events. So we do both. We study and address those things as well as the things that often get neglected, such as science, technology, language, linguistics, genetics, and so on. Things that may not bring food on the table or money in your pocket right now, but things that are definitely important and for our future. So that's what we are composed of. It's myself, Wujau. We also have Black Panther, Sister Naya, Brother Uncle Kek, Brother Osari Motep, Brother Sanjeti, and the Brother Jonathan, also known as the Magi. All right, so we're the Amara Squad, and tonight we have a special guest, and we're just gonna get into it. And I'll pass the mic on over to our brother Black Panther.
Alafia Bandala, baby Fahudie is your favorite warrior, Black Panther. Thank you all for tuning in. We got this great and qualified guest today, Dr. Rick Kittles. Everyone wants to talk about genetics these days. It's big arguments across the conscious community, so we thought we would bring in a person that's leading in this field, a person that is doing this, a pro, an expert, someone that we can ask questions to. So you don't have to believe the Amun Ra Squad. You don't have to read the articles. You don't have to even pay attention to the hundreds of references we gave you. We've brought in a specialist that is here to answer your questions and the tough questions that plague this community. So I'm going to let Dr. Rick Kittles introduce himself, his qualifications, his credentials. Dr. Rick, tell us about yourself and your qualifications and everything like that.
Okay, cool. I want to say greetings to the brothers and sisters out there. Very happy and excited to be here and have some shared discussions and dialogue around this issue of race and genetics. I am a geneticist by training. Got my PhD from George Washington University in Washington, D.C. in the biology department at GW, and had a lot of work around genetics of diseases in people of African descent. I've done a lot of work looking at cancer and cardiovascular disease and the like. I always wanted to understand more about genetics and how DNA played a role in, traits like skin color and eye color and hair color and hair texture and the like. So always was excited to learn more about genetics, and so when I went to grad school, that was the big focus. Around the same time, I was learning a lot about the African Eve and looking at mitochondrial DNA to trace the migration routes and the history of humans across the world. And from that, I really, it just galvanized me and solidified me, and as it relates to becoming a geneticist. And I said, whatever I learned, whatever tools and techniques I learned, I would definitely use it to answer questions that were important to people of color around the world. And so that's what I've been doing.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We're honored to have you on our platform. We've referenced you so many times in so many videos. So it's great to have you here so you can speak for yourself. So some people might be asking, why are we even doing this show? What's the purpose? Why is this important? Well, there's a cultural revolution going on in America amongst people that consider themselves African Americans. That cultural revolution is centered around where people are from in Africa. Everyone is taking these genetic DNA tests. They're being initiated in different spiritual systems from the continent. They're researching different cultures, trying to figure out where they're from. And this is unique to Dr. Rick Kittles because, correct me if I'm wrong, Doctor, your DNA testing company is one of the only ones that advertises that you can tell where a person, a particular type of people associated with their DNA. Is that correct?
Right. Our company, African Ancestry, specializes in tracing the ancestry of people of African descent. So we can actually look at these lineages and tell you where they are common within Africa, which ethnic groups and geographic region and all of that. We have one of the largest, we have the largest African lineage databases in the world. And so we've been working on collecting that data for a very long time, actually since like 95. And we're able to perform these tests with pretty good statistical power, given the comprehensiveness of the database. But yeah, we are the only ones that can do that. Actually, we were at the time we started the company in 2003. At the time, there was only 2 other companies in the world. One of them was Family Tree DNA out of Houston, Texas. The other one was called Oxford Ancestors out of England. And so we were the third company that emerged in 2003. There was nobody doing this as it relates to African descent people. There was, tests for Jewish lineages. There were tests for Native American and European ancestry, but nothing for African Americans. And so we fit that that gap. We filled that gap.
Wow. So not only do we have a African geneticist here, but a pioneer in this field as well. So, it don't get no better than this. People, what you provide people is something that is priceless. People want to know where they're from. Where does their DNA lie in Africa? It's something that was stolen from us that once you get that back, it's very emotional for some people, as I'm sure that you encountered in your years of the profession,
Yeah. I mean, I've seen, it's funny because I've seen all kind of responses from people who get the test. And there are many reasons why people get the test. I mean, if you think about, there is no other community in this world who has experienced what people of African descent, in particular West and Central Africans, I'm talking about those that were enslaved and brought to the New World, has experienced. And so when we talk about African Americans, I mean, it's a very unique population history. And so we are now at a point where there is this excitement and strong interest around using this technology to say something about ancestry, because we don't know. I mean, we've been just ripped of all of that information for generations.
Absolutely. Sister Naya, you want to chime in on that?
Yes, thank you. Hi, Dr. Kittles. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. My name is Naya Amara. We've talked a few times in our inbox, and I've asked you for some feedback on some of the research I was doing, learning about DNA. So I'm just excited about you being here. You talked about really being in the forefront of genetics and DNA, specifically to African American people. Could you tell me a little bit about why that was important in terms of in the scientific world? Why was that important, and why did you feel the need to kind of bring a product that helped people like us who have a historic lineage in Africa, including the transatlantic slave trade? Why did you think that was important for us?
Well, it was important to me and my family, and I felt my community. I felt that I wasn't disconnected from my community. You know, it's funny because when I was in graduate school, everybody was like, "What are you going to do with your PhD? What are you going to do with your PhD?" You know, some people got PhDs to make a lot of money. Others wanted the prestige of writing papers and getting all these scientific achievement awards. But I knew that if I was going to invest this time and effort, that whatever area I was going to focus in on, it was going to be used for the betterment for African people. And so I've always been committed to that, always. And so it's just something that was instilled in me from the start. I study, you know, the biology and the genetics and the environment around people of color for whatever purpose, be it health or ancestry or family history, genealogy, all of that is you know, and it's funny because it's all intertwined at some level. I mean, we're not isolated entities, right? Even within our bodies, we have DNA that interacts with other pieces of DNA in our body. We have DNA that interacts within the various different environments within our body, the physical and social environments in which our body interacts with too. So we're all connected in some way within, you know, with each other, but then also our environment within our community. So I've always had this sort of this very, very strong interest in wanting to make sure that I contributed in some way to people of African descent. You know, it's funny because when I was in even before grad school, when I first started, you know, my education at a, you know, in college, I remember reading a lot of the Black scholars at the time. You know, at that time we called them Afrocentric writers, right? Afrocentricity, and you know, folks like Charles Finch and Van Sertima and Sheikh Annie Joe, and you know, a slew of important characters in the history of science for people of African descent. And I just wanted to play my part in that whole. So I saw an opportunity for me to be a part of those lineages, those scholars. And I said, you know, I want to contribute and inspire just like they did.
Absolutely, absolutely. We all understand the willingness and the want and the desire to contribute to the great body of knowledge that our people have produced throughout time. Brother Ong, you wanted to get in on this? You got to unmute yourself, Ong.
Okay. How you doing, Dr. Rick? How you feeling?
I'm great. How about you?
Hey, man, it's absolutely a pleasure to have you on our platform. Like we like to say around here, if there's a need in the community, then we need to be the ones to fill it. And you absolutely have done that. Really appreciate that. And so you're in a field where a lot of people that are not scientifically literate, they will actually call it, specifically in this community, they'll call it DNA. Well, that's the white man's science. So let me ask you this question. How does it feel to be in a field where a lot of Black people consider to be the white man's science? How do you feel to be in that field being a Black man?
Actually, I don't feel that way. I mean, you know, what inspired me to get into this were folks like I said, Charles Finch, who was a physician out of Atlanta, who was understanding, who had a very strong understanding about science and the African component and the history of science in Africa, and Sheikh Annie Joe, who actually, you know, in terms of biological anthropology and the role in which the history of human populations emerged out of Africa, you know, his contribution was just phenomenal. So I see myself in the line of folk who were, you know, I continue that line. So I don't see this as a white man's science. And, you know, the funny thing about science is folks say science is unbiased, you learn, and if you adhere to the scientific method, it's unbiased. Well, that's a lie. Mm-hmm. Every nation uses science for their benefits. You see what I'm saying? And so I think a lot of times we have to think about or contextualize what we're learning within the framework of being people of African descent, and stop worrying about somebody else saying this is their, or saying that this is their science or this is their knowledge. We can utilize that knowledge for our benefits, and actually expand on it through our own efforts.
Excellent point. Excellent point. So let's get into the nitty gritty, as we say. What is the study of genetics in your estimation, Dr. Rick?
Well, the study of genetics is the study of the chemical bases that make up DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. And those chemical bases, there's 4 of them. For short, we call them A, T, C, and G. Those nucleotides. Genetics, the study of genetics explores the transmission or the heritability of traits due to the inheritance of DNA. So we look at what individuals inherit from their parents, 50% of their genome for the most part from their mother, 50% from their father. We study the transmission of that genetic material, right, that we inherit, along with the transmission of particular traits like skin color or body height or body weight or even susceptibility to disease. So early in my career, I was trying to understand how genes travel throughout the world, and use that to show the migrations of people throughout the world. Then I said, well, you know what? Genetics is important for particular traits. So if we understood more about the genetics of skin color, it might tell us something about the history also of these populations. Because, there's always these debates about East Africa and the Middle East and who came first, was there back migrations, blah, blah, blah. Well, if you can really utilize genetics to help answer those questions, and we're doing that more and more. Scientists now are doing that a lot more by exploring what we call population genetics, exploring the genetic history of populations. That's what population genetics really is. And we're trying to understand how these genetic variations are scattered throughout populations, and how by populations moving around, how that influences also the genetic variation in those communities.
Wow, that sounds like a serious study.
If I'm
go ahead, Ujawu.
All right, I had a question to kind of come off of that. If Dr. Kittles, if you could explain the difference between the different tests that the results that people are getting. On social media, we see a lot of people post up percentages, and those percentages are a result of a certain test, and then they'll post up test results that will give the haplogroups on the maternal and paternal side. Could you explain the difference between those, if there is a difference between those results?
Yeah, there are. I mean, so there's 3 different types of tests, and almost all the companies out there perform these 3 types of tests. The first test is what we call mitochondrial DNA, which looks at the maternal. It's a maternal lineage, meaning it's inherited maternally. Everybody has mitochondrial DNA, and men and women have it, and they get it from their mother, but women pass it on. So it's a situation where if you're a male, you get it from your mother, she got it from her mother, she got it from her mother, but you don't pass it on. But if you're a female, you can pass it on. So it's what we call maternally inherited, and it's directly inherited. So it doesn't change unless there's like a mutation. It doesn't mix or what we call recombine or anything. So it's what we call clonal inheritance. And the funny thing about mitochondrial DNA is it's a separate genetic system in the body, right? So within our cells, we have DNA within the nucleus of our cells. And there's over 3.5 billion of those nucleotides that I mentioned earlier, A, C, T, and G for short. But mitochondrial DNA is not within the nucleus. It's in organelles called the mitochondria. And I'm getting a little too technical right now. I didn't want to get this technical, but the bottom line is mitochondrial DNA is its own genetic system, and it has its own sort of history, and you can utilize that marker for the history of maternal lineages in the world. And you can actually trace them all back to this mitochondrial Eve in Africa. The second test is Y chromosome DNA. Y chromosome is paternally inherited. So that means you inherit it through your father. Men only have that Y chromosome. So the male transmits it to the female. Transmits it to another male, the son, and then they transmit it to their sons. And so it's paternally inherited. The Y chromosome is one of the 23 pairs of chromosomes. So on the 23rd pair, which is what we call the sex chromosome, there is an X and there's a Y. We can look at the Y chromosome and some markers on the Y to say something about the paternal lineages around the world. And in fact, we can look at all of them and trace them back also to Africa. The Adam, right? The Y, or the paternal Adam. The next set of genetic system that most of these companies test is called autosomal markers, and that provides what we call an admixture estimate. Earlier that you guys said that you see folks posting their percentages.
Yes.
Those percentages represent admixture, and those markers come from the DNA that's within the nucleus that I mentioned earlier, and they're scattered across those 23 pairs of chromosomes. Some companies actually perform a test with almost 1 million of those markers, those genetic markers, or what we call genetic variants. These are different types of changes in the DNA, different polymorphisms. We call them SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. And there's actually, tens of millions of them that have been found throughout the genome. If you compare any two people, there's going to be over 1 million variants across their genome. But for the most part, these companies test a little less than 1 million, maybe 700, 500,000 of these throughout the genome. You can pull that information together and come up with an estimate of what we call continental ancestry. And by that, I mean percentage Native American, percentage West African, percentage European. Now, some populations actually have more dimensions to that, but for the most part, they represent those 3, what we call parental groups. And so those are the 3 systems: mitochondrial DNA, Y chromosome DNA testing, and then autosomal markers, or what we call admixture testing.
Okay. Thank you for that. I just have one follow-up to that. This is a question that's often asked as well. Based on that, can a person be autosomal? Their autosomal test results show that they share DNA with continental Africans, but yet their maternal and or their paternal be of a lineage of non-African lineage. Yes. Based on their haplogroup. Is that possible?
Yeah. Yes, it can. I mean, you got to remember, each one of those systems tells you something, sort of almost like the potential is there to tell a different story. The Y chromosome will tell a story about all the men in your family, that line of men that come from your father. So it will tell you something about your father, your father's father, your father's father's father. You see what I'm saying? But just that one line of males. The mitochondrial DNA will do the same thing for the females. Your mother's mother, your mother's mother's mother. That one line of females. But guess what? Within our families, we have multiple lines. And so just if we go back to your grandparents, those are 4 different lines there that you can test from just your parents. If you go back another generation, it'll be 16. So when you think about it, if we go back to the period of slavery, there's over like 16,000 people that contributed to your DNA. And Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA is not going to tell you everything about all of those lineages. The admixture test, though, will give you a really good estimate generally of what that mixture looks like. So yes, your admixture can say that you are, let's say, 25 or 30% West African. And then you look at that person's mitochondrial DNA and it goes to Europe. And then you look at their Y chromosome and it goes to Europe also, or to, let's say, Asia. And you're like, well, I didn't see the African in those two other systems. It must not be true. No, we are a hodgepodge. Almost all populations are a hodgepodge or a mixture of many different continental groups. Of course, there's isolated groups that haven't been mixing for the most part, but most what we call outbred populations, like here in America, represent a mixture of to various degrees of different continental groups. So yeah, you can actually have an individual's admixture test be completely different than their mitochondrial and Y.
Okay, I definitely appreciate that clarification. That's a question that comes up a lot, and I think people misinterpret the three results that you just went over, and they kind of cross them up and misinterpret and may think you have certain assumptions that they'll get disappointed at and not really understand the results.
Right. So I think you have to be clear that each one of those genetic systems tells you something about that particular lineage. Doesn't tell you everything about your entire genome. I think we think the average person thinks that they can buy a $100 or $150 or a $200 or a $300 test, and they're going to get an answer to everything about their genome, and that's just not the case. I mean, there is no test that's going to tell you everything in one test.
That's good to know.
It's important. That's very important. So you can tell. Oh, you want go ahead, Sister Nye?
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of segue into the discussion about race, given that that's kind of a hot topic. And could you talk a little bit about race? You talked about populations and how the study of genetics looks at populations. Could you explain to us if you feel like race is biologically meaningful and kind of contrast that with the social construct and how we can look at it to best kind of become a more educated people as it relates to this subject?
Nah, you couldn't wait. You couldn't wait one more minute to get to that.
I know. Man.
I hear you. She couldn't wait. I understand. It's good.
Go.
Boy.
That's good though. That's good.
Right. No. She's asking some serious questions. And so, but this is race is one of the most contentious areas out there in the sciences. And it's not just science, it has a social political meaning too, right? And so that's why folks really get upset and they argue. Different scientific organizations, every couple years they have a meeting and they come back with this white paper and they say race is not real over and over and over. Folks are like, when are we going to stop talking about this? We're never going to stop talking about it because race is a social construct, okay? So it has very strong social meaning and context to it. But biologically, there are no human races. Now let's go back a second. And then I'm gonna get really into this race thing because this is what I've been working on for a very long time. And I've always wondered why people just don't get it. And they don't get it because it's one of those things where you feel, as the average person on the street, you can just look at somebody and say what race they are. Oh, I know what race that person is because look at their hair or look at their skin color. For many African Americans, race is based on skin color and to some extent ancestry. Mm-hmm. But that's not what race is. Race is a zoological construct. Okay, when I say zoological, so the evolutionary biologists use race to define subspecies. So we have these different classes of organisms, right? And so you have species and you have subspecies. So an organism can be a subspecies. You can have several subspecies, or what we call races, if they have been isolated from each other for a long enough time that the genetic markers are starting to differ. That doesn't mean that they can't reproduce. It just means that genetically, those two populations of, let's say, salamander or some shrimp, some brine shrimp or something, starting to differentiate. They're moving out, diverging to different genetic outcomes, right? That's what we call a race. And for the evolutionary biologists, they actually have a criteria for the genetic differentiation of races. And for the most part, if it's above FST, average FST is above, I think it's 0.3 or something like that, 30%, then you have these separated groups that are races. But races can interbreed for the most part. Now, if we were to look at human populations, do they represent races in a zoological framework? No, they don't. And why is that? Because folks can have, okay, number one, folks can, it doesn't matter, as long as you're a human, you can have babies with another human, right? For the most part, unless you're just infertile or whatever. And I tell my students all the time, genes don't stay in your genes. Anytime you bring two people together from different populations, they're gonna mix. But the point is this: humans' populations have not diverged or been isolated long enough to develop what we call races. Now, if those European explorers back in the late 1400s didn't do what they did, maybe we would have been on a route towards races, human races. But what happened? Folks started coming in from other continents and mixing, okay? So human populations have not been around or isolated long enough and around long enough to actually differentiate into different human races. And it's very clear. When we look at the genetics, we see, for the most part, very similar in terms of genetics, but there are some differences. But those differences do not define races. Those differences are defined by ancestry, family history, and geographic distance, meaning the further away populations are from each other, the more genetic difference they are. Because people mate with people close to them. They don't go, to the other part of Africa just to have a baby. You know what I'm saying? They're going to get down with folks in that community. And the further away you are, and you compare two groups, the further away they are, they're going to have more genetic difference than they will if they're closer together geographically. Also, what has shaped the genetic variation that we see has been selection, okay? So while all human populations share a lot of genetics, what the little bit that we do see that's different is due to how those groups reproduced, and then also what environmental stimuli they were exposed to, meaning pathogens, infectious disease, right? Malaria created a major shift in the genome of many West and Central Africans, because in order to survive in an area where there was high malaria, there had to be changes to certain genes like Duffy, G6PD, beta globin gene. Those genes were shaped by the history of malaria in those communities. Now, does that mean that they are a race different from other West Africans? No, that's just a small set of genes. But for the most part, we share strong similarity in terms of our overall genetics across the genome. So we have to move away from this whole race thing in genetics. Race is real. I'm a black male. When I get pulled over by the cops, I know better than anybody that I am a black male, okay? I do not sit up there saying, that I even though I have a European Y chromosome, that I'm European and all this blah, blah, blah. In America, race is real. So we have to realize the social component to race. And also, since I study disparities, I also want to know and be clear that when we look across different populations, there is a differential in incidence and mortality and the distribution of resources. And so sometimes we categorize that in racial terms. But that doesn't mean that there's a biological race. That just means socially and demographically, we call those groups races. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
African Americans, Native Americans, Latinos, Hispanics, whatever you want to call it. Some people call them races, but the bottom line is that is an opportunity of measurement of those social demographic groups, not a biological term.
Mm.
Wow, that was a very great response. I'm glad you hit all those points. In our community, in the last 3 years, Amara Squad has kind of been at the forefront of talking about race and genetics. What do you think about haplogroups? Do you feel that haplogroups is enough to justify race? And if so, why?
I have very strong feelings about haplogroups. And this goes back to what we were talking about earlier about, folks say that genetics and science is European or white. And remember what I said? I said all communities utilize science for their benefit, right? So we have a bias. Everybody has a bias. And I don't care what anybody says. We should leverage our own science and technology for our betterment, okay? I don't have any
Not apologetic for that.
No, I'm not apologetic for it. No, not at all. But what gets me upset is when I study mitochondrial DNA variation and Y chromosome variation across the world, and 90%, 95% of all, 99% of the scholars are of European ancestry. And they label the different haplogroups based on a European construct. I have a problem with that, especially when all of the variation is rooted in Africa. So Africa should be the center of that explanation of haplogroups, and it's not. Give you an example. There's probably, I forget how many haplogroups there are. I'm talking about the major haplogroups, 30 some odd, I think. More than half of them are in Europe. Now, if we look at mitochondrial DNA variation, in Europe, it's not a lot of variation, but they've labeled all kinds of, they have so many different labels on that little bit of variation. And then you go to Africa where all of the variation lies. If you were to add up all the non-African variation and put it next to the African variation, it still wouldn't even come close. And we just get one letter for Africa, L, the mitochondrial DNA L haplogroup. I guess it's this way for y'all. Seriously, think about what I'm saying. So in Europe, we have H-I-J-K, I believe S and T, all these different haplogroups there that have been characterized in Europe. And there's only one group for Africa that defines all of the African variation. To me, that is extremely disrespectful. Why? Because what we have to then do is frame all of the African variation just within that one letter and break that letter up. And it doesn't compare to what we have in terms of defining European variation. So for me, that's a problem, right? It also minimizes the history and the level of variation that exists within Africa. So, if we were to use haplogroups to define races, it would be extremely problematic just based on that. But even if it wasn't the case, we still couldn't use it because throughout different continents, we see that areas where populations go in and out of that area, of that geographic area, you know, the movement of populations within an area or the movement out of an area. That's what we call these transition zones. And these transition zones have a blur in terms of these haplogroups. And so it's not easy to use haplogroups to define races. For instance, Dr. Charles Finch used to call the Middle East, he called it the Northeast African extension. I don't know if you guys remember that in his in some of his work.
Mm-hmm.
What he was saying was at one time that was considered part of Africa. That whole Middle Eastern sort of Sinai, all of that area was considered Africa because there was this movement back and forth with Africa, and it was called this transition zone. And if you look at the genetics today, we see this transition out of East Africa, out of the Sudan, all of this variation being like a bottleneck, a subset of what's in Sudan being a subset of what we see in the Middle East, which is then a subset of what we see in Asia and a subset in Europe. So it's a transition zone. So it would be extremely problematic to use haplogroups to define races. I think they're useful in terms of saying something about migration. I think they're useful in terms of population history, but in terms of definition of races or using them to define races is problematic because once again, they're only part of your genome, of your genetic makeup. Remember, your mitochondrial DNA may say one thing and the rest of your genome say completely something else. So why would you want to use that to define race?
Well, there you have it. There you have it.
You know, you're dealing with a pro when you take the time, you write down all these questions, you write them out, and he answers like 4 of them in one sentence. You know?
Right. Yeah, he hit all the points.
Can I ask a question?
Go for it.
Well, this is a good question right here. This is the elephant in the room right here. Specifically in the conscious community.
You about to ask what I was about to ask.
I just need to know, based off of our presence in North America, the African Americans, would you say that we are the original Native Americans? Professor?
I was going there.
We need to know that. We have several books popping up on the scene. I totally disagree with that, but I want to hear what the professional has to say, the one that studied on genetics. Can we talk about that? Are African Americans, Native Americans, are we closely related? I mean, talk to us about that, sir.
Here we go.
I need that.
No, that is a misnomer, a falsehood, an outright lie. Okay, that's exactly what that is. We are not the original Native American. There is a history that Native Americans have, and actually, it's disrespectful for African Americans to go out and say that they're Native American to the rich Native American cultures that have been here for thousands of years. I mean, Native Americans are descendants of Asians who came here, who migrated here. And we have the archaeology, we have the biological anthropology, we have the genetics, the fossils, everything is there, show and prove, okay? So there is no debate on that. We look at Native American populations. They were at one point very large with the settlement and the arrival and settlement of Europeans. Those populations were brought down to very few numbers. And so the genetic diversity, the biological diversity, the cultural diversity was lost, okay? But they were not of recent African descent, okay? Those Native Americans were not. Now, for some reason, there are African Americans who are here who want to claim this connection with Native Americans. I don't know for what, outside of maybe trying to get some money from casinos or something. I don't know, but they want to have this connection with Native Americans. And it's funny because it's almost like we are the Native Americans. And so whoever was here or whatever history that you can show coming from Asia just wasn't true. I mean, it's even more shocking that you would even say that. But I also don't understand why a black person would want to be anything other than African. Okay, that is the real deep sort of issue that has to be addressed by those individuals who continue to argue. I mean, they continue to argue this point. Now, I'm not going to say that no black folk came here when the Europeans came here early on, Columbus and all that stuff, right? Because I'm sure there was black folk on those ships. Mm-hmm. I'm almost positive that they were black folk. Mm-hmm. I'm even suggesting that some of them could have been Moors from Spain, okay? But there was no wholesale movement of black folk to the New World and then contribute all of what the Native Americans did. And for some reason, that was lost too, I guess, in the history, that, you know, it was the black experience that contributed to the Native American history. I don't know, but I'm just saying there is no evidence of this wholesale movement of people of West and Central African descent being here before the transatlantic slave trade. So the African American community that's there today came from, we are descendants. I'm going to say this really just clearly, okay? The bulk of African Americans are descendants of enslaved Africans from West and Central Africa. That's it.
It don't get no much simpler than that. But since Brother Unc wanted to crank it up, you know, let's go all the way into it. Dr. Rick, talk to us about the Olmec civilization. And are these people genetically African?
Look, I haven't studied the Olmecs. I've seen articles, I've seen pictures, I've seen a lot of that. One of the things that I think we also have to be clear on, and this is what I call, it's not just me, a lot of my colleagues call this racial thinking, okay? Racial thinking is also typological thinking, meaning that there are these types that human populations adhere to. You're within one of these types. You're either Native American type, Asian, European type, and then they have different classes of Europeans, East, West, Scandinavian, you know, Mediterranean. And then you have Africans, right? The stereotypic Africans, right? And so you see some pictures or some sculptures or some art of individuals that might resemble some West Africans. And you say, oh, those are Africans. That's typological or racial thinking. You're assuming that those Native Americans, the Olmecs, didn't have variation in terms of their phenotype. All populations have variation in their phenotype. You can see Asian influences in Europeans. You can see even African influence in Europeans in terms of their phenotypes, their physical features. So no, I haven't bought into that Olmec thing, and I don't believe it. I think that those are some broad-nosed, big-lipped Native Americans.
Facts.
Woo.
Facts.
I just want to go on record and say I did not probe Mr. Kittles for any responses prior to him coming on the show. because Dr. Kittles, the reason why I'm saying this is because they're going to say, he sounds just like the Amin Ra Squad. I know the Amin Ra Squad told him what to say before he came on the show. No, we spoke on the phone one time and multiple times through messages.
Right.
We didn't tell this brother what to say. We didn't tell this brother what to think. We didn't give him the answer. He didn't even know the questions we were going to ask.
Right. So, right. I didn't. And that's the good thing. That's the good part, is that this is all fluid and live. Right.
Right.
So it's interesting because, you know, we've had some African scholars who have explored that issue, and we have to be honest too with scholarship. I mean, at certain time periods, we may think one thing, and then as the evidence goes further, we see otherwise. And remember what I said about science. Science, for the most part, is biased. I mean, I hate to say it. I mean, you could say, "Oh, well, we're gonna do this in a scientific way." Even how you use that has a political component to it. So, I mean, it's you have to understand. You have to understand that, and we have to be honest. I mean, I don't agree with everything Van Sertima or Finch or even Sheikh Andy Job said. I mean, and if you look back at the history of how science emerges, folks have opinions. They try to prove their opinions with facts and theories, more facts. And then down the stream, you find out that they were wrong. That's cool. That's how science operates. But I have yet to see any evidence biologically of this African influence on the Olmec civilization. I mean, I know folk personally who have been throughout the New World and explored genetic variation in these Native American groups, and we do not see this signature of West African ancestry in those groups.
That's you said a mouthful. And we had quite a few people. We have quite a few people watching. And I hope this clarifies some of those questions that people have been asking, because genetics and this topic has been a running topic inside of our Facebook group for the past year and a half, off and on. And so I do see a couple of people, and I think that they're enjoying the conversation. Matter of fact, I know they're enjoying the conversation because they're saying, "Let him go in. Now I can go to sleep." He answered that. Now I can go to sleep. So.
Yeah, they've been waiting on that.
Right. That's right. I forget that it's late out there.
Yeah, no, I don't know if we were going to have opportunity to open it up, but Ben, I guess you can continue on. But there are some people that do have questions inside of the chat. I don't know how we're going to, maybe we could read a couple of them or invite.
Yeah, we can get
well, we have like another controversial issue that we need to address before we open up the chat. We do want to address this issue of the Neanderthal and whether or not white people are a different species. And I say that in quotations because this is the conversation that often comes up in our community. And although I don't subscribe to that paradigm, could you talk about speciation in Neanderthal and if you feel that the current people that we identify in our social construct as European or white, if they are a Neanderthal, or if they're just plain old Homo sapiens sapien.
That's crazy.
Naya's getting right to it.
Oh boy, the debate.
So this whole Neanderthal issue emerged in terms of the genetics when one of the skeletal remains of Neanderthals was sequenced. The DNA was isolated from the bones and sequenced, and this Neanderthal DNA profile emerged. And one of the things you noticed is that it did differ in many ways with the modern human Homo sapiens genome, and which suggests that obviously it is a different species. But what was fascinating as this emerged was that there was some some actual sequence profiles that Neanderthals had that are embedded or in the gene pool of many European and Asian populations. But it's not common. It's not common at all. I mean, it's maybe at the most 5-8% of the population. And it's just these small stretches of DNA that have been defined as quote unquote Neanderthal. My take on that is this: if we were to look at the genome, the entire genome, all 3.5 billion of these base pairs, we'll find that the genome of humans has multiple histories. Meaning that, remember when I was saying that part of our genome evolved due to climate and environmental exposures, pathogens, infectious disease, high latitude, high sunlight intensity, being around areas with no vitamin D, blah, 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 put pressures on the genome at different time periods in the history of Homo, not just Homo sapiens, but Homo, because remember, Homo sapiens sapiens didn't just come out of nowhere. There was this evolution and this divergence that occurs. And so if we go all the way back to Homo, that means that part of our genome goes back, over 1 million years. You guys see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So we should look at our genome as a mosaic of pieces or chunks with different histories from different time periods. And so when we talk about this Neanderthal sequence, it's a part of a sequence from that time period. Now, what populations were around during that time period? Modern humans were around there. In Europe, they were restricted to that European area, and there's also some that were found in Asia, right? Those populations have a history with that that Neanderthal period, and so it's not surprising to see that segment in a portion of those populations, individuals from those populations. You guys see what I'm saying?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So, yes, there is evidence of this Neanderthal, people call it Neanderthal gene, but it's really just a profile of the DNA that is old and that some Europeans have. Now, if folks had any sense, they would go to Africa and look at some of these old remains and sequence and see what we call archaic sequence or archaic profiles, DNA profiles, are there, and see which African populations may have those. And I'm sure that it'll be those that were historically near those archaic populations. You guys see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
So now you can boot that reality up to saying that, whites or Europeans are Neanderthals, or a subgroup of Europeans are Neanderthals. But I mean, there's no. What are you trying to say? Are they like less advanced or something? Is that the argument?
Right.
I don't see that. But I do believe, and I've seen the evidence that there's chunks of DNA that have different histories in our genome, and there is a chunk that goes back to this period of Neanderthals that's common in Europe. Okay, modern Europeans.
Yep. The part that gets me though, let me say this real fast. The part that gets me is that you can go to Africa and you can find A00. That's archaic. And so in Africa you have inbreeding. So I don't understand why Neanderthal is so crazy, but yet we never want to talk about what happened on the actual continent. So I found it to be very, very interesting. Like Brother Saul always says, then why don't you just say you just don't like white people? Just say that.
I know he in the chat room, so
just say
I would just go ahead and say it.
Well, you don't have to make up nothing. Just say what it is.
You don't like white people.
It's interesting. I'm telling you that if you go throughout the genome and you look at the age of these lineages in our genome, they vary because we have been around as a genus for a long time. And so that there's chunks of our DNA that are very, very old, and they were important in terms of the trajectory of evolution that we were on. Maybe they were for standing upright or whatever, but those chunks are old. And then there's those that change, those that we inherited from past species and the like. So it's not surprising. What's surprising is that people want to boot up a behavior or a phenotype over a damn profile sequence.
Mm. I
Thanks.
I just have a question. Since you mentioned something about that, could you, and hopefully this doesn't go. This is still within the same question. When we hear things like human beings or Homo sapiens sapiens, we share X% with a banana or X% with a rat or whatnot. What does that actually mean? Like what percentage? Because this is the thing. For example, it's known that human beings share, I believe, 98.6% with chimpanzee. But yet, when people read these reports about the Neanderthal, it will say something like 4%. And so what some people will do is say, wait a minute, if we share 98.6% with the chimp, but then there are people walking around with only 4% with the Neanderthal, that means that we're more like chimps than Neanderthal, etc. So I think there's a little bit of confusion there. So can you, if you understand the question, could you kind of elaborate on what does it mean when humans share X% with, a banana or whatever the case is? Is that are they looking at something different?
So that's a very good point. So I've always had issues with how this was used, and this is another way that science is used politically. So when part of the argument of the Human Genome Project was the folks wanted government funding, and they wanted different countries to support it from all over the world. And part of their position in this was, let's sequence the human genome and show that we are 99.9% alike. And then folks was like, well, how are we alike with apes, chimps or whatever? And then it was like, oh, 98.5 or 98.6 or whatever. And what they were saying was, when you sequence the genome, they look at the genes and they said, oh, these are the same genes. So we're 99.9%. But they didn't look at sequence variation. That wasn't part of that discussion. They were talking about how many do we have the same set of genes. And so there was a different set of genes for chimps. And so that's what that argument is about. And it's being used mainly for political sort of purposes, because in reality, it doesn't mean much at all.
Right.
It really doesn't. All humans share. Humans are 100% identical, if that's the case.
Right.
But we know that it's not true. You know what I'm saying? There's no population where they have fewer genes than what the other population. We all have the same set of genes. The structure of our genome is pretty much the same. But the variation that's within there, that genetic variation, is what's different. And that's where the action is, actually. That's what makes some people darker than others, some people's eyes bigger or nose wider or whatever, hair thinner.
And you said earlier that you said about approximately 1 million variations.
Yeah, so if we compare any two people,
Mm-hmm.
right, just off the street, any two people, it's about 1.5 million SNPs that would differ between them. So at 1.5 of those 3.5 nucleotides, there could be a difference there. On average, around 1 million, 1.5 million.
Dr. Rick, this next question is something that different people have asked in the community. Can you talk about the population of genetics and what we call ancient Egypt, if you're familiar with that?
I really haven't studied a lot about Egypt, to be honest with you. I've studied a lot about West Africa and Central Africa because that was what was important for me as an African American. I'm not saying Egypt wasn't important. Egypt, was inspiring to many of us. But in terms of genealogy and family history and understanding about my potential health based on my genetics, Egypt had nothing to do with that. So I spent a lot of time studying West and Central Africa. I think it's a very rich and interesting, exciting history. I know that when you look at East African populations and that whole Nile Valley, there is a continuum of variation and this transition out of Africa into the Middle East. I think it's really interesting and exciting. But I will tell you this. If there is an Eden, it's in the Sudan. Meaning that area has so much genetic variation. And that variation is consistent with what we see in West Africa, Central Africa, North Africa, South Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and Asia. I mean, so that area has enormous variation. And you see in the Sudan, you see what we call the elongated African, tall, long limb, dark skin, the Nilotics, all these different features that's consistent within Africa. You see there. So, we talk about where is the birthplace of modern humans. I actually think it's somewhere in that area. Now, when you think about the history of Egypt and the influence that Egypt gave to Europe or had on Europe and the Middle East is staggering, right? But what about the influence that the Sudan gave to Egypt? Because that predates all of it. If in fact that's modern human origin, geographic origin, right?
Yeah, that's a fact.
To me, that would be where where some interesting action would be.
Can you explain, Dr. Kittles, transitional morphology?
Can I explain transitional morphology? I don't understand the context.
Neither do I. It was a question in the chat room, and I'll read you the whole question, and maybe it'll give you some more context. It says, can you explain the use of transitional morphology rather than missing link?
Oh, okay. So remember I was talking about these transition zones. If you look at areas between continents where people have moved, we see this area of transition in the biology and the genetics of those populations. When you have this typological approach, you're assuming that there are these types, right? These racial types. And historically, when you have this typological thinking, there is no bridge between those types. The bridge actually is this transitional morphology. But historically, people didn't do that. They would say, oh, there must be a missing link between these folk and this folk. You see what I'm saying?
Right.
That's so my understanding of what the question, that's my understanding of what he's trying to say.
Right. It's a very unscientific question because basically they're trying to, you answered the question when you discuss race in terms of morphology. We don't see one morphology in one particular population. We see variations in different populations. So there is no such thing as transitional morphology, whoever answered the question. But I wanted to say something to you, Dr. Kittles, about DNA testing, because this is an important subject in our community. Yes. The validity and reliability of DNA testing. We often have these circular arguments regarding it and whether it's valid. And as Black people, can we trust the results? Could you talk a little bit about the reliability and validity of testing and the processes that you use even in your own lab to ensure that the results do what they say that they can do?
Right. So I think we also have to understand that when you get a DNA test, the accuracy and the validity is really a reflection on how well your reference database is. So if you're asking a question about what is an individual's haplotype, those are pretty simple questions to answer. They can do the sequencing. They can look at your polymorphisms, and say, oh, you have this stretch of variation, so you're haplogroup A or haplogroup C. Those are simple. But when you start saying that an individual is of Finnish ancestry or Yoruba or Fulani from Cameroon, you should have a database that's reflective of those populations and more, right? What we call comprehensive databases. And so part of the accuracy is based on how well your database is. I mean, you can have a database with 100 samples in it, and you will find something. You see what I'm saying? You'll say, oh, well, this is close. You know, oh, let me give you a perfect example. When I first started this, you know, and this is, I had to learn this, you know, the hard way. I remember I tested Henry Louis Gates early in my career. I was at Howard University, and this is before I started the company. And I had at the time a pretty good database, African database. But my database was good for West and Central Africans. So I had from Senegal all the way down to Angola, pretty well sampled, really good set of samples from there in my database. I had very little data from Egypt, the Middle East, the Sudan, North Africa, right? Because for me, in my at that time in my thinking, I thought that all I needed was West and Central Africans, and I can answer the question for African Americans, not thinking that obviously some of us have different ancestries outside of this transatlantic slave trade, meaning some of us may have European or Jewish or Middle Eastern ancestry. So anyway, I tested him, and I didn't have any Egyptian samples. No, I'm sorry. I didn't have any samples from Israel, Jewish samples in my database. I had some Egyptians. I had some Somali and Sudanese. And so when I did the test, he came up Egyptian from northern Egypt. And so I told him, I said, you know, it looks like you have Egyptian ancestry. He was all excited. He said, oh, you know, I am a descendant of a king, he said. Come to find out, once the database grew, that it wasn't Egypt that the match was in. It was actually Israel, and he had Jewish ancestry on his mother's side. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. Now, the reason why I went to Egypt is because that was the closest set of samples in terms of variation consistent with Israel. So I had to learn that the hard way, but it was good. It was refreshing because it made me think bigger than just where I was thinking. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. And I could admit I was wrong, but the point I'm making is that I didn't have a big enough database to accurately answer his question. I was relying on him too, telling me about his ancestry. He said, "Oh, my mother's black. My mother's black. Yeah, she's black, but her mother's not black." Okay,
right.
So I found that to be interesting. So let me go back to answer your questions. I think I went the long way on that one. Sorry.
No, that was great context, though.
Right. The database is important, but also your statistical algorithms that you use to determine the match is important. So we have the largest database for African Americans. We use a likelihood method. It's a probability test to see how likely this match that we found in the database is. And by that, we look at the frequency of the match, the geographic distribution, all of that stuff. And so, so there's a lot of components to the accuracy. The other thing that's also important too that we have to realize is that some of us have very old lineages. For instance, some of us may have mitochondrial haplogroup L0, which is the oldest lineage in the world. And it's common throughout West Africa. You can go from Senegal, Western Senegal, all the way to Eastern Cameroon, and you'll find it in equal frequency across those broad range of geography and ethnic groups. So there's no way to say this person is from Gabon or this lineage is Gabonese. You see what I'm saying? Because it's so common, it's so old. But then we have other lineages, like for instance, Oprah Winfrey's mitochondrial DNA lineage, which was an L3 subgroup, which is one of the more recent ones. Like for instance, the L0 goes back almost 100,000 years, 80,000 years, right? So that's why it's a broad distribution. But Oprah's was only within the last 10,000. It was very restricted to a region in Liberia. So that also plays a role too. It's like going to the phone book and saying, oh, I'm going to find my friend's phone number. What's their name? Brown. Or
and it's thousands of Browns.
Smell.
But if you say Kittles, I mean, there's not a lot of Kittles. You see what I'm saying? So it really depends on that lineage in terms of how well you can accurately assess where it's from. So it's not a simple answer. That's why, I don't know, a lot of times we think that everything is simple. I'm going to pay this money. They're going to answer all of my questions. And what they do is they get their answers, their question answered, and they put it on Facebook or whatever. And then everybody has a billion more questions.
That's right. You're right about that.
Dr. Kittles, can you touch on that Jewish comment you made about Henry Louis Gates? Some people in the chat room, I think, are confusing what you're saying. When you say he had Jewish ancestry, what do you mean by that?
I mean, he had a lineage that was common in Israel. He had a mitochondrial DNA lineage. I forget what it was, T1, T2, or something like that.
Okay. And again, this goes back to the difference between the mitochondrial test results, the paternal test results, and then you have the admixture. And I think this is something that people really have to make clear and distinct. Like you said, it tells three different stories, and I think people mismatch those. But if I may, I have the website showing and pulled up, and I know, and based on to speak on what you just mentioned. On the website, this is AfricanAncestry.com, by the way, for those who are watching. You have a question here. It says, do you have the largest database of African lineages? And the answer is yes, 33,000 as opposed to the competition, which may range about 621. So that speaks volumes to basically what you were just speaking about. I know, for example, the company 23andMe, theirs in reverse. They have a high sample of European ancestry than the African component, and a lot of people are getting tested with that company, et cetera, et cetera. So it will show up in the results, and like you said, as the database grows, that's why they're always updating their database and updating their reports and things like that. So just wanted to show that for the audience on what you were speaking about. But I find it interesting. You have the first question is, can you identify an African country of origin? Yes. Competition? No. Can you specify African ethnic group? Yes. For African ancestry, but competition? No. And I think those answers are based on what you were saying. I guess the quality of the database and those samples is why you're able to do it and other companies are. So is that correct? Assessment to say?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
I was saying basically the reason why the answers to the questions on the website are yes for African ancestry and no for maybe the competition has to do with the quality and of the database and the samples that are there.
Right. That's the big part of accuracy. I mean, if your question is, am I of African descent or European descent? I mean, that's a simple question, right? But to really dwell into the question of ancestry and these ethnic groups, you need to have a really good database in order to answer that. And that's why, for the most part, these other companies don't provide that level of inference. All they do is tell you that you're European or I mean, African or Native American. And because of their databases are so comprehensive for Europe, they can tell you something about Europe. Like I told you, I have a European Y chromosome. I know that because of the European databases.
And I'm the opposite. I have a non-African maternal line, a West African paternal line, and then my admixture says I'm different. 70% shared with Africa and 30% shared other, and so
What's other?
uh 25% European, somewhere European, and then the other difference is Middle East somewhere, you know.
Okay.
So 70-30 split altogether.
Okay.
So when I first got my results, that's what made me study and really realize the difference and the different stories that these results tell. And I can understand why people get confused, but I think people should really do the knowledge and study so they won't misinterpret it, because I've seen a lot of people do that with the percentages.
Right.
Dr. Rick, I don't even know who this person is, but a friend of mine wants me to ask it, so I'm going to ask you. What were the test results of Cherokee freedmen?
Hmm.
Do you know who that person
Yeah.
is?
No, you said it's a friend of yours, but you don't know who it is.
No, I don't know who Cherokee freedmen is, but the friend of mine asked me to ask you the question.
Oh, okay. That was kind of weird.
I mean, it gets confused.
So, yes, there. The question deals with a study that I did, looking at the freedmen community in Oklahoma. The freedmen community is a community of people of African descent who were part of those five so-called civilized tribes that were part of that Trail of Tears, from Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, marching into Oklahoma to the reservations. Their land was stolen, their communities were devastated, and many of them had, many of those Native American communities had relationships with to some extent, with Black folk, meaning they either had slaves like the Choctaw or Chickasaw, or they had them in their organization in terms of leadership, like the Seminole, or they just were a part of their community and helped stabilize them, in particular during this time of instability during that Trail of Tears. Imagine that. It was very hard for those communities to go through that period, but African Americans helped stabilize those communities. In early 1990s, the federal government gave them, those five tribes, reparations for the Trail of Tears, upwards of like 40 million each or something like that. First thing that they did, those tribes, was kick out the Black folk. And they said, "Oh, you're not really Native American. We just, you just hung out with us, but we can't get any of this money." So the freedmen, they called them freedmen community, the Black freedmen, which were part of those. They were actually on the rolls. Some of them were on the rolls. Their families were on the rolls. They got kicked off. They then sued for some of the rights to that money from reparations. Now, at the time, these nations, once they got that money, they started buying up property, developing real estate, casinos. I tell folk all the time, they went from ashy to plastic, overnight, really, because, they had the poorest wealth, poorest health. And then, with this money, they then built up their community. And in many cases, the Blacks were turned away from those communities. So I went into Oklahoma. They wanted me to do some testing of the freedmen to see if they had Native American genetic ancestry, and maybe they could use that information in court to prove that they were part of those groups. And I told the leadership at that time, I said, "Look, we can do this, but it doesn't mean that you can actually use this genetic data in court. There's no real precedence for you doing that from a research project." But they wanted to do it anyway. They felt that would be at least a start in the direction to do it needed to be done. So I did the testing on about close to 100 and something individuals who themselves or their family members were on the rolls of these groups. I mean, I've seen pictures that folks had of their family members who were like in leadership. Like, for instance, one woman, her grandfather, his name was Billy Bowleg. He was a Seminole chief at one point, and she's African American, part of the Black freedmen. So some of her family members were tested. And so when the results came back, I went back out there, and for the most part, there was very little Native American ancestry. Now, there were about 4 or 5 individuals, African Americans, who had over 30% Native American ancestry and who had significant, Native American ancestry. But for the most part, most of the African Americans had just as much or less than the average African American in the country, which is around 5-6%. 5-6. So they were pretty upset about that. And I think it's funny because for the most part, people like science and technology when they can use it for their benefit. Mm-hmm. And so once they realized that this DNA testing wasn't going to help them, they then said, this is garbage.
Oh, that's
they kicked you out.
That is a key. That is a key point you just made, and that is the sentiments that we see a lot. Just what you said, DNA is very good when it comes to paternal court cases to determine fatherhood, paternity tests and things. But then if they can't use it to push a preconceived belief, then it becomes garbage. It becomes pseudoscience and things like that. And I think you hit it right there on the head.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, it's good for criminal court too. Get you off a case.
Right. Yeah. Now, there's strong utility for genetics across many different aspects. But what I find fascinating is people their value that they place on the genetics is based on the utility. And if they can't use it, there's no value to it.
Mm-hmm. That's it.
If they can't reconcile that with their belief, their traditions, or their folklore, family history, they don't want to use that.
And how about the psychology of the transatlantic slave trade? I think it's a deep hidden underlying psychology that we want to kind of deny it, and so people want to reach for something else. Say, wait, okay, well, we were here first. I wasn't part of the slave trade. I'm not a descendant of a slave, and they kind of latch on to that. And when the genetics don't show up, then I guess cognitive dissonance kicks in, and they just go for anything and deny the DNA and the whole science of genetics altogether.
Right. But it's funny because they're not just denying the science, they're also denying history, right? The historical record.
Uh-huh.
Denying themselves.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I think we emptied the clip on the questions unless anybody else got any more.
No, that was a lot of good questions, man. I really appreciate you coming through. I think it kind of helped the community. We have a very, very intelligent listening audience, and we have a few knuckleheads, which is to be expected. And so around here we teach scientific literacy, so it makes it very, very important for you to stop by, Professor. I mean, Doctor, I really appreciate that. Really, and we really support your company, and we absolutely send business your way.
All right, appreciate that.
Matter of fact, I'm going to show the website one more time, and is there anything that you want to highlight on the site? It looked like the site had a makeover recently because I've been paying attention now. It looks like had a slight makeover
Yeah, it probably has. I know Gina Page, my business partner. She's amazing, man. She has a creative team of folk, and she's really into marketing and all that. So I can't even tell you. I don't even know how much it costs anymore. I've been in the lab. You know what I'm saying?
So
Gina's done some spectacular work, and she has a great team out there.
Matter of fact, let me just show her picture again. That's Dr. Gina Page, right?
I think we lost him for a second.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think he dropped.
Maybe he'll come back in. But that's the sister whose picture is showing now. Also a founder of the African Ancestry. But there's a question on here. Let me just show this real quick.
We need to get that sister on here, man. That would be like a trap.
I was just thinking that.
man. Come on,
I
man.
was just thinking that.
Yeah, that's important right there. We can't leave her out.
No,
Goodness.
certainly not. But look, this question here, the last question on the page. Hopefully, everybody can see it. This is on the website. It says,
Are you
well,
100%
actually, let's go to
black owned with
let's go to the
black
question before
science?
that, because this is what people have a problem with as well. The question is, do you research or sell my DNA? The answer is
Never.
never. Okay, and that's one thing I know that the company prized themselves off of. I've seen a video where Dr. Page and Dr. Kittles speak on this, and maybe when he comes back, he can address it. But the last question though, are you
Hit him up,
100?
Panther.
Huh?
I'm telling Panther, go ahead and hit him real quick. See where he at. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Yeah, the last question. Are you 100% black owned with black scientists? And the answer is yes.
Oh, that's on the thing, huh?
That's on it. That's on his on the website.
Shoot them dead in the water, man. Screenshot that. That's man.
That's a
I'm glad.
checkmate right there.
That's
No,
man.
Dr. Kittles, he's back.
Okay, Dr. Kittles, I was just going over the last three questions on the site. One is, well, last two. It says one, do you research or sell my DNA? And the answer is never. And I remember seeing a video of you and Dr. Page speaking on that in terms of not doing that like the other companies, and also not receiving external influence by way of funds and things or whatnot. I kind of vaguely remember you all touching on that. So you can keep the science what it is and have the freedom to do what it is that you all do. So.
Right. Now that was very important, and also that's one of the reasons why it took a while for me to develop the company and the test, because I wanted to find somebody who had very similar sensitivities as I did about this issue of genetics in the African American community. So Gina, shares my sensitivities, and we definitely wanted to make sure that if we did this in the community, we would set up these what we call terms and conditions, where we would not any test to any test results or DNA samples, personal or financial information to any third parties. And we've been consistent with that. Not like other companies where they actually have given information to FBI databases, sold information to drug companies and the like. So.
Right, and I see that on the site. It says as far as the other companies, take a look at the fine print. Make sure you read the fine print.
Yep.
So
well,
that's
every company. Whenever you buy a test from any company, there's a thing called terms and conditions, and you have to read that, before you put that credit card information in there, because in some of these companies, they tell you pretty much once you send that sample in, it's theirs. They can do whatever they want to do.
Wow.
Whatever they want to find. And produce royalties from that, and you get nothing.
Right.
These royalties. You mean get wow.
They getting paid off it.
Get paid, man, boy. So I'm glad that was really posted on the site, and that kind of really helps our position here. And we absolutely appreciate that, and that's good. So we need to do business, more business with your company. That's absolute, and that policy right there should actually help out people in determining, what company they want to use. And I think that's an excellent policy right there, keeping their information sacred. So we really appreciate that.
Right, and we did it because I don't think I'm that much different than any other brother or sister in the community. I mean, somebody came up to me and asked me for my samples. I want the same level of protection,
Right.
So.
Yeah, that's
Dr. Rick, did you do a study on an African burial ground in New York City?
Yep. Yeah, that's how I actually started. That's when I started collecting the data, the database. And that was in 95. I think I started doing that. So I was working with some scientists at Howard University. I actually started it when I was in grad school. Then I got an appointment at Howard, my first faculty appointment. And then it really blew up after that. But yeah, so there was a in Wall Street, down the street from Wall Street in New York City, off Broadway. there was a centuries-old burial ground. They called it on the map of New York City. It was denoted Negroes Burial Ground, and it went back to the 1800s. And it was actually a place where enslaved Africans and free Africans were buried over several generations. And so there were thousands of people buried there. And remember, at that time, New York was called New Amsterdam. It wasn't called New York. It was New Amsterdam. It was a Dutch sort of colony initially. And there were enslaved Africans there. Many people say, well, how would they be slaves in New York? They weren't doing a lot of the agricultural work. They were doing mainly domestic sort of servitude stuff, but they were enslaved. They were doing domestic sort of chores and work. And those communities, blacks in that area started to grow. And so they were buried in this cemetery. Now, as the city grew, as New York City grew, they encroached on that burial ground. And that burial ground became smaller and smaller. They built up all around it, on top of it, throughout bodies, all type of stuff. And so in 1990, somewhere around 90s, they were building, the federal government was building the GSA building, General Service Administration building. And they were building the foundation, and they found these remains, these burials, coffins and artifacts, and they were pulling them out every day. Folks in the area were like, this is, because this is Manhattan, and there was a lot of blacks walking around there. They were like, obviously this is part of our community. So they stopped the construction. Mayor Dinkins, the black mayor, was mayor, and we had a black president also, Clinton. That was a joke. They stopped it and said that they were going to send all of the remains that were left to Howard for study. Howard University had like a $10 million grant or something to study those remains, and then to rebury them in a memorial that was built there. So the building, actually, the federal building went up. It just wasn't as big as what they wanted it to be. And there's a memorial there now. This is right next to the World Trade Center, okay, where the memorial is. What's funny though is many of the early scientists before Howard University was involved, they had all these European anthropologists studying these remains, and for some reason they would say things like, these are Europeans or these are Native Americans, they're not Africans, because they knew that it was African, number one, and if it was African, then they could stop the burial, they could stop the construction. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And it was a big hoo-ha, but the descendant community in New York didn't have that, and so we actually was able to stop construction, get the remains, 427 of them sent to Howard, and we studied them. So I isolated DNA from the bones of those remains. That was my job, to isolate the DNA from the bones and determine through the mitochondrial DNA if they were African. That was the first question. Are they African or not? We could look at their skeletons and tell that they were African. We could look at the burials. They had Dinka symbols. I mean, they had Dinka symbols on them. They had Sankofa symbols on the coffins. So it wasn't hard for
it's like staring you in the face
to say, these are African descendant people. This is a cemetery of African descendant people. Then the biological anthropologist was looking at the cranial and the long bones and said, these are African people. Then Rick comes in with the DNA and says, these are L haplogroups. These are African people. So
the triple,
a lot of fighting for that to happen. But yeah, I was involved in that.
Wow, that was the triple hitter right there. The cranial, the
archaeology,
the archaeology, the materials, and the genetics. Can't get any better than that. Yep.
That was the first time I actually worked with what we call an interdisciplinary group of folk, and they were all black, all of them. Historians, archaeologists, biological anthropologists, geneticists. I mean, it was amazing. That was amazing experience. I'll never forget. I mean, it made me, it reinforced to me what I was doing and who I was, and it helped shape my identity as an African American geneticist.
Mm.
Yeah, you seem very well rounded when it comes to like Afrocentricity and just being centered in your identity and who you are as a person. Did science help you to shape that identity, or did you have training in Afroecology, or kind of how did you get here?
It's funny. I grew up in Long Island, and my parents were not, college graduates or anything. They were just hardworking Black folk who really pushed me along and wanted me to be successful in school. So, in one level, I was an achiever in school, science and math. But at another level, I actually had a strong connection and love for my community. And I grew up in an area where there was suburbia, but also, poverty too. And so I didn't have to go far to see what poverty looked like, and it was Black. Mm. And that also made me sort of realize that as I progressed in life, I had to always think back and look back and try to contribute and help others along the way. So I guess it was just part of my journey that I sort of developed that connection with Africa. But I'll tell you one thing. I mean, I didn't get a PhD to write a bunch of papers on Tay-Sachs disease in Jews. Okay, I got a PhD to study Black folk, and I've published over 170 papers, and not one of them is on white people. Okay.
Wow.
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 Well, we're glad to have you as an asset, an ally in this this fight to raise scientific literacy in our community. Man, when I reached out to you, I knew it was going to be a classic show, but you gave us more than what we bargained for.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it, bro. Another thing, this is why, what you guys are doing are so important. The sister asked me a question just now about my how I was anchored in the community and developed. When I first started graduate school in DC, I went to GW. So I left New York, went into DC, started graduate school. One of the things that kept me grounded and also reinforced my love and understanding that whatever I did should contribute to Black folk was this African study group that I was a part of. It was called Tu Wamoja, which is Kiswahili for we are one. The African study group. So back then we didn't have the internet like this. We had the internet, but it wasn't like this. We didn't have these chat rooms and all this stuff. So we would meet at the public library. We would meet downtown in DC at King Library, and we would read Sheikh Annie Diop's book. That's the first time I read Civilization and Barbarism. I met with folks who were just average Black folk on the street, bus drivers, teachers, other students, undergrad, waiters. I mean, it was everybody would sit there, and we would sit there and chop it up on these books. And it was a lot of sharing that was facilitated, and it made me grow as a person a lot better and develop a lot better in terms of my love for Africa. One of the things that we did, I'm not going to keep you guys much longer. I know it's getting late.
We wanted the same about you.
Real funny.
Roll out.
We started. No, but I'm serious. I mean, I was like your age, Ben. I was like your age, and sister, and I was doing what you guys are doing now. And I was sharing what I was learning with the community and learning from them, right? And so one of the things we did was we were all like, we loved the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in DC. So we would go in there, but we didn't like the African Hall. So we started talking about how bad the exhibits were and how outdated they were. And we shut down the exhibit. After a couple of years of protest, we would go there every Sunday and give tours. We gave tours at the government's museum, and we would show how inaccurate their exhibits were. And especially their African Hall and the Evolutionary Hall. I mean, they were so outdated, right? And the funny thing was, I was actually a graduate student at GW, learning from anthropologists who actually worked there. You see what I'm saying? So I had Smithsonian faculty members who worked at the Smithsonian who were wondering, like, who's this Black study group who's protesting, you know, and I was in their class. And they had no idea that it was me, part of that group, contributing to the discussion around closing down the exhibit. So the bottom line is we were able to close it down. We were able to bring in African-American anthropologists and scientists to set up a committee so that it could improve the exhibit. And that's exactly what happened. Now, I was like first, second year graduate student. And so it was just interesting and exciting to be a part of that. And to see how much when you had the knowledge and you had the confidence and the bravery to go up against, you know, an institution like that, and just be almost like the spook who sat by the door, in a sense, because I mean, I would hear discussions in class about the Black study group, and I would be sitting right there like
they don't know it.
It was funny. It was funny. But anyway, that was all part of my early experience in the science.
You talking to a native DC, born and raised in DC, so I know exactly where and what you're talking about. Smithsonian.
You know what? I find that real interesting because we had like a similar experience, and that was in New York, the Museum of Natural History.
Yes. I actually went up there and met with some folk about that. I remember two Emoji, our group went up there and talked to them too. Yeah.
Going there, and they're a little bit behind too in their department.
Right.
I'm talking to the people, they're picking up the skulls, you know, knowing all the skulls and all that, and the professors in there looking at me like, well, who is this guy? I'm like, you know, and I'm hitting them with information. They was like, that's interesting. They're a little bit behind in their studies. So you know what? I always find it very, very important to be African-centered at what we do, and it's good to hear that you've actually used that. You know what I'm saying? To further and to do what you're doing. And I think the community really, really needs to hear that. Absolutely.
Appreciate it.
Definitely. Yes.
Yep. All right. Well, it's getting late, so
yeah.
Appreciate you coming through.
We should do this again though. I enjoyed this.
Yeah, we're gonna do another one. We need to have the sister on too, the other doctor on.
Oh yeah,
Gina. Important to have her on there. Yes.
Yeah, and maybe see, I've been watching your lectures that's been shared on YouTube, and I think you've been doing an excellent job of explaining things where a layperson can understand, because some of the visuals that you show when you talk about race being used as a proxy, but you give an example of how useless it is because of self-reporting, and I remember you talking about the census and stuff. So it'd be good if you come back and kind of go over that, because I think that's something very important that people need to understand.
Yep, that'd be cool.
And maybe do a reveal or something. Maybe somebody could get a test and pay for it, and maybe
one of you guys can do the test, and we do a reveal.
Okay.
How many? Who's done the testing? Nobody's done the African Ancestry test yet?
No, not. No,
we all went to other companies, Rick.
Yeah. Shame on us. Shame.
I did mine 8 years ago. I did mine 9 years ago.
Oh yeah, where'd you go? Family Tree DNA or something?
No, Gene Base.
Oh, Gene Base. Yeah, I think they was that was out of Europe, I think.
Yep. Yep. They got and they update your results every year, but I'm definitely gonna have to come your way. Give you some of that money.
All of us need to, because no, I mean, you hit on the head. The quality and the samples of the database speaks volumes. That's just it. That's the game changer. If African Americans want to know their percentage and the resolution, the higher resolution of where you can narrow down geographical communities or genetic populations, African Ancestry is where to go, hands down.
Yeah, that's
Rick,
real.
I'm sorry, man. I ain't had that 300 on me, man. I had 99,
hey,
man. So,
Dr. Kittles is not responsible for that. That's Dr. Page. We're
right. I don't have anything to do with that. But listen. Always, I tell people all the time, Black History Month is the best time to get it. It goes down.
Okay.
Price goes down.
Okay.
Right,
Black
right.
History Month.
February, you on, man.
Hey,
February.
look, make sure for you coming on the show, we'll make sure I send you a pair of shoes. All
What
right?
size you wear?
Yeah, what size you wear?
Size 10. Size 10.
Size 10. I'm gonna make sure I send you a pair of these ab jewels right here.
Oh, those are nice, man.
All right, yeah. You know, y'all can go to the website and check it out, abju.com. You
Okay.
know, abjuwear.com.
Abju. Abju. Okay.
Abju. So yeah, you know, we're actually supporting the community and changing the hood to a community one shoe at a time. And so we really appreciate you coming through, and we'll make sure you get a pair of these Abjus. Absolutely.
All right, bro. Those aren't repurposed Louis, are they?
No, he's original right here. You gotta understand that.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, you know, we don't do none of that. We go to the source.
I'm messing with you.
Yeah, he's just messing. That's good. But listen, I mean, I appreciate your time, because you could have been doing anything else, and I know that you're busy in the laboratory, like you said. You didn't even know that the website had a makeover. So that just tells us how busy you are.
Yeah, and actually, right before I got on, Gina had texted me and said we got to talk. So yeah, there's been some changes. Yeah, I gotta catch up.
Yeah, so and I know you're making a transition to out there in LA and stuff. So we really appreciate your time, because we done took up 2 hours. We could go in, but we know you busy.
Nah, we gotta save.
Right, we gotta save it for another time. So yeah.
Yeah, but I'm serious. I do want to come back. You guys are good.
All right, well, hey.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
All right.
All right, Black African Power.
All right now.
All right, bro.
So let me switch over 1 second. So Ben, and you get a chance to, I guess you got some closing remarks, and I do have to close out with the Abju commercial, so everybody can know where to go and get those shoes. So
yeah, get them pre-orders, man. They be here at the end of the
week.
week.
Abju footwear, man. You know, Amara Squad, we doing big things in the community, man. Get you a pair of those, man. And while you're getting a pair of those, you can also go to pantherwear.com and get you a pair of those too, man. Support us, man. You know, we changing the community, man, changing so we won't have to depend on Nike and all these other companies that's not doing nothing for our community, man. Come support us. That's the biggest thing I stressed tonight. And you already know we booked.
Yeah.
We booked.
We booked.
Bring out them books.
Exactly.
Bring out them books.
Exactly. Can't forget the books. Break out the books. All the books. You know. And there's more coming. There's more coming for the new year 2018. There's more material coming from all the members of the squad, and some other folks that are share in what we're trying to do, promote scientific literacy, and we're gonna make it happen. So
if you in Atlanta, come by the spot in Lithonia, man. Come by the Black Dot Cultural Center.
Oh, that's
in Atlanta, man.
Yeah, how you like it there today, Ben? I wasn't there. I got snatched up.
Waited for this man for 4 hours.
Got snatched up. Oh man, one Adam 12. Anyway, but yeah, stop through the Black Dot Bookstore and Cultural Center in Lithonia on Main Street, man. I'm gonna give y'all the address. That is 6984 Main Street, Lithonia, Georgia, 30058. The home of the Amara Squad. All right, let's get it straight. You know what I'm saying? Around here, we don't just talk the talk, man. Hey, look, as y'all can see, we walk the walk.
Yeah, definitely. And I just want to thank those who took time out and hung with us and watched. We had quite a few people, and I saw the interesting questions. Shout out to Alan Brown, asked some good questions. Hopefully you got some of those responses. I think Ben, you were relaying some of his questions in there, Shezmu, and a lot of others. So hopefully everyone enjoys.
Taba, all right.
Definitely. So
wasn't he? I guess he couldn't make it.
Got
man.
called into work, man.
Yeah. Right. So that's good. It's nice short. Well, for us it's short. It's a nice short and sweet
I'm getting out
episode.
Of here. That ain't gonna keep me.
You ain't gonna keep me. I gotta get up and go to work tomorrow, man.
Right. No, we're gonna
go to the coaching center.
All right, so
you coming through tomorrow, Ben?
No, man. You stood me up.
I didn't stand you up, man.
Stood me
I got you.
All right. So
Nice.
I'm gonna close out with this commercial. So y'all check it out and make sure y'all visit abjuware.com and come visit the bookstore. We could chop it up. We got these books in there already. We could pull up a topic and go in on the topic, go live, have a nice discussion. That's how we do it. So I'm gonna say
Hold
peace.
on. Shout out to Brother Tariq, man, and their guest, man, that helped me form my company. I appreciate that all the way. That's the godfather of the street.
Brother Jamu at the Black Dot Cultural Bookstore. Shout out to him as well.
Yep.
Shout out to Mike Taylor, Panther Wear, and shout out to all the brothers that's doing things. And Naya, you want to shout? You here?
I was like, yeah, Mike, my boy, Panther Wear.
Now, you have anything to close with before I hit it?
No, I just appreciate.
Oh yeah, Mike, your boy, y'all having a good conversation.
I just want to shout out to everybody in the chat room. You know, just holding it down. Mo in the chat room, Sean in the chat room. You know, Alan.
Dagger Squad.
Everybody in the chat room. Just
Mossy Clan Warriors, man, Mossy Warriors.
All the support. I just want to shout out to everybody. I love you guys.
All right,
I appreciate the Mossy though, and man, the translating team, man, I really appreciate them, man. Mm-hmm.
Definitely, the Seshu Mani Medunecha.
Sir, is fire.
Definitely.
On fire. I ain't gonna lie, they straight on fire, man. I enjoy watching that, man. When y'all come, I really do. I ain't gonna lie, man. I learn something every time I watch that, man. Y'all gotta do more of that, man.
Listen,
and the sister book, man. Where the book at? Where the sister book? Did you have it on the?
Yeah, we're gonna. I'll show it again, but I want to put y'all onto something. The audience onto something called Saba University. It's an online university similar to Coursera, similar to Udemy, but it's African centered, where we're gonna have teachers, courses there, just like that. It's gonna be the home of the Amara Squad, home of all everybody that's pushing scientific literacy, STEAM, or STEM and STEAM, whatever the case is, but from African centered approach, things that matter to us the way we need it to be done. So that's gonna have courses. If you're already familiar with Udemy.com or Coursera.com, now we're gonna have Saba University, which is gonna be an online teaching environment. So all these different topics you hear us talk about on the Amara Squad, the different shows, we're gonna put together some professional, polished video lesson courses that you can receive a certificate and the whole nine. So be on the lookout for that as well. Yep.
African spirituality course coming up.
Yes.
Put it together for y'all.
There it is. So anything.
African psychology coming up.
There it is. See, we already got them on the way.
African Senate. Yeah. Real black atheist style.
On the ride.
A course on real black atheism, huh? There you go.
Yeah, facts.
All right, so I want to say peace, because you know we got a habit of making these long goodbyes. You know that's an African trait. I know I do.
Hey, we just ain't been around for a while though, man. I'm glad everybody came and support us. Y'all act like the channel knew it's been up there, man. They smacked me around a little bit, but we been there, man. Make sure y'all subscribe. Okay, hey, make sure you check me out on Daily Motion. That's where I'm at these days.
What's your channel name? Is it
Real Black Atheist?
Oh wait, guys, I forgot to give a shout out to Chief X. Love you too.
Oh man, now listen, Chief X, boy, Chief X, man.
Kiss from Naya, boy.
Listen, Chief X, man, that brother, that brother, that what do you call it? That brother is like, what do you call it? Yeah, but no, what do you call it? No, nothing. He just comes straight at it.
No nonsense.
Like he don't care about popularity or nothing. He's like, look, I'm gonna deal with this. Those stones is pseudo. This is pseudo. Alkaline.
Unapologetically.
Yeah, there you go. Unapologetically. So Chief X.
Everything. Unapologetically everything.
Chief X.
Hey, can I say this?
Pseudo Hunter.
Can I close it out with this, man? I really appreciate Chief Broken Foot. You know what I mean, for listening to the podcast. Man, I hope you learned a lot, man. It was a real powerful show, man. You know, it was.
He didn't.
All right, so I'm gonna say peace.